Joining me on the phone now is Rob Bovet. Now, Rob, I just want to start off by asking about the law in Oregon, because Oregon was the first state in the country to begin requiring a prescription for pseudoephedrine. Mississippi has now followed suit, but a number of other states are using a database-only system. And that's something Oregon tried for a couple of years. But why the decision to switch then to a completely prescription-only system?
Well, we didn't actually use a database. We actually manually collated the logs and essentially did the equivalent of a database, trying to sort out who was illegally diverting pseudoephedrine to meth labs and who wasn't. And the job became, frankly, overwhelming. There were just too many Smurfers, the people that divert the pseudoephedrine, to chase down. There were too many people to arrest, and we were looking for a true prevention solution rather than yet another reaction. And we also discovered that really there are, and we can get into details if you want, there are three basic forms of Smurfing, and the electronic database monitoring systems only have the ability to prevent or identify one of those three, so it's really easy to get around them.
I think we're actually going to have to explain Smurfing, so if you wouldn't mind just starting there.
Sure. Smurfing is just kind of a coined term that refers to anyone really who purchases a retail pseudoephedrine product that is later diverted to make methamphetamine, whether it's diverted to the major drug trafficking organizations to cook it up in super labs in Central California, or it's diverted to mom and pop who are cooking a small amount of meth on the kitchen stove or in a 2-liter bottle. So it's just diverting retail pseudoephedrine to the manufacture of meth. And again, there are three primary ways that this is done.
Okay, can you talk about those three primary ways?
Sure. There's what I call exceedance Smurfing, which is where I, as either an addict or a cook or just someone that want to make an illegal profit, I just go from pharmacy to pharmacy to pharmacy, buying as much pseudoephedrine as they'll let me buy from all these pharmacies, and then divert it in that fashion. That's exceedance Smurfing. Then there's group Smurfing, where I gather up 10, 15, 20, or if you're a big organization, literally hundreds or thousands of people, and you each buy a box each, just one box each. All below the line, all under the radar, nothing that can be caught or identified by an electronic tracking system. And then the third variety is false ID Smurfing, where I just get 36 different IDs and I use one ID at each place, and again, no electronic tracking system is going to stop that kind of Smurfing either. So primarily group Smurfing, but also false ID Smurfing just completely evades electronic tracking systems.
Okay, now data does show that meth lab busts are down in your state, but I'm wondering about overall meth use. Are Mexican drug cartels filling the gap that's been left by local meth cooks?
Well, and that was kind of a red herring that the pharmaceutical industry trotted around Oregon. There's two reactions to that. One is the reality is that even when we were taking down 500 meth lab incidents a year in Oregon, most of the meth was actually coming from Mexico. Upwards of 80% of the meth was coming from Mexico, so the bulk of it was there anyways. We did what we did here in Oregon, not to get rid of meth, but to get rid of meth labs, because that's what was catching fire, blowing up, and poisoning the environment, poisoning drug-endangered children. So we need to identify the specific problem being addressed. It wasn't meth, it was meth labs. Now, having said that, there's a second important point. Shortly after Oregon did what it did, the next year, Mexico followed Oregon's lead, and then 2 years ago, Mexico went one step further by banning pseudoephedrine entirely. What that is meant is that the meth coming from Mexico is significantly less potent. It's very pure and very cheap, but it's much less potent because they don't have adequate pseudoephedrine to cook up the powerful variety of meth that addicts seek. So in Oregon, what we've seen is a dramatic drop-off in drug arrests, all attributable to meth arrests, and we've seen a dramatic drop-off in meth treatment admissions and meth abuse. That wasn't why we did what we did, but here in Oregon, we've had kind of a double whammy punch. We've not only weakened the meth on the streets of Oregon that is supplied by the Mexican traffickers, but we've eliminated the ability of addicts to cook their own in replacement. And that tragically is what you're seeing in your state. Is you're seeing weak meth from the Mexican drug trafficking organizations, which is really good and great news, but it is helping to fuel a resurgence of local small user meth labs because the addicts, of course, want the more powerful variety of meth.
And Mr. Bovet, we'll have more from you later in the program. For now, Stan, back to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Nicole, I wanted to go back to you first here. It sounds a little bit like businesses are kind of taking it on the chin here, and your group, of course, represents a number of retailers in the state of Indiana. I wonder if there's anything you think that can be done to try to turn businesses whose products, let's point out, are being misused and criminally misused here into backers of a plan to try to curb meth trafficking instead of opponents of it, which they seem to have been both here and in Oregon.
First, I want to say that pharmacies as well as drug companies, as far as sales go, over-the-counter cough and cold medications, the sales are pretty minimal. We're not getting huge profits from sales in Indiana. And I think that electronic tracking proposed by Senator Yoder, the NPLEX system, would be a great solution to all of this because all the neighboring states would be connected, all pharmacies would be connected. Right now, only some like big box stores that have the NPLEX system in place already that are having to deal with it in other states, in Illinois and Kentucky, are using it. But once it's broad-based with everyone, I think it'll be a good solution to the problem.
Senator, as soon as the legislative session starts up again in January, it seems likely that when this issue comes up, you're going to see a high-powered lobbyist or two from the pharmaceutical industry come knocking on your door and ask you, what in the world are you trying to do to my clients? How do you tell them that you're trying to do the right thing and that the pocketbook has to come second?
Well, it's happened before. The last few years, I've introduced legislation for this, and they have indeed fought me heavily on this. My question to them is, such as liquor industry or beer industry, they have don't drink and drive. Budweiser puts millions of dollars a year in to try to stop and curb drinking and driving, underage drinking also. What has the pharmaceutical companies done to try to help this? Nothing to what I've known so far.
So that leads me to a question I'd like to start with Jody on. It seems to me that when we're dealing with drug problems on a nationwide or a statewide basis, we tend to be relatively reactive in terms of our solutions. How, especially from a criminal justice point of view, can we be proactive and get ahead of this problem, or is there a way to do such a thing?
Well, unfortunately, I think this particular problem has already gotten ahead of us, way too far ahead of us. I think a good step would be to make the pseudoephedrine a prescription drug. The other thing we really need to do is change our outlook on how to stop the person, the individual, from using methamphetamine because of its highly addictive nature. Just putting them in prison, even for 2 years or 4 years. I see them, I put them in prison, they're gone 3 years, they're out, I see them again in 6 months. They're back in jail, charged with a new meth lab. Just the mere fact that it's prevented from them for 2 or 3 years doesn't cure them from the addiction. There's got to be some big steps in rehabilitation in order to prevent the person, the individual, from wanting that drug over and over again. What
about, we have, of course, drug courts in the state of Indiana that deal with trying to stop the recidivism rate or bring it down. Are there parts of those programs that deal specifically with methamphetamine? And if there aren't, do you think it'd be worth trying to increase that side of it?
I do. I think it would be a very valid point. I live in Posey County as well, 26,000 people. We only have 2 courts. We certainly don't have a drug court. We do have a community corrections program, which is new within the last 2 years, in which we do users, not manufacturers, but users. But where we're really hurting is a facility for rehabilitation. The closest one is 3 counties away from Posey County. The closest one that's really geared toward methamphetamine is in Louisville. And individuals who don't have the money or the ability to enroll themselves in those sort of long-term treatment programs just get fallen out of the way.
Well, I do want to continue this conversation in just a minute, but we do have more from Sarah and Rob Bovet in Oregon. Sarah?